I hope you're doing really well. Today I will be doing the Booktube Top Tens Tag. This was created by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and with this tag Jason is taking a tally of some of Booktube's favourite books. So this list of 10 books is not necessarily my 10 favourite books ever, mostly because some of them I haven't read in quite a long while, so I'm kind of going off my memory of them, but they all kind of mean something to me, whether that's the contents of the book or the context in which I read them. Because there are 10 books and I don't want this video to be super long, I'm not going to explain the plot or anything, I'm just going to briefly talk about what it is about each book that means that it gets on this top 10 list. So I'm going to start off at number 10, counting up to 1. So at number 10 we have My Family and Other Animals by Gerald. Durrell. I'm pretty sure I watched the film adaptation before I read the book, and I absolutely love the film adaptation as well. I very distinctly remember the second time that I read this book. It was the middle of winter when I was living with my family in the Blue Mountains, which is a much colder place than Perth. I think it must have been the winter school holidays as well, and I was freezing. We were all huddled around the wood heater fire that we had in our house there, and I needed a book that would warm me up. So I picked this book, which is set on the Greek island of Corfu, and although the family live on Corfu for many years, it mainly focuses on the summer seasons, and it really did work. It really warmed me up. I think I read it in the space of 2 days or something like that. The beautiful descriptions of this sunny Mediterranean island made me feel a lot happier, and possibly reminded me of Perth as well, because Perth has quite a Mediterranean climate. Number 9 is On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwen. This was my favourite book that I read last year, and I think it perfectly epitomises why I love a short novel. Rather than reading this, I felt like I sort of swallowed it whole in a way. It was less reading a novel and more like watching an incredibly beautiful atmospheric film. At 166 pages, it's technically a novella, and I love a story that knows exactly when it needs to end. With something this short, every word needs to be necessary, and with something this short, every word and every sentence is full of meaning. I also love it because I very much related to Florence, the female character in this book. Number 8 is The Robber Bride by Margaret Atwood, which is the only book on this list that I don't own, because I read this while I was at university living with my grandparents, and so I read my grandmother's copy. My grandmother and my mum, my grandmother being my dad's mum, both love Margaret Atwood and both recommended her to me when I was old enough to start reading adult books, and The Robber Bride was the first book of hers that I read, and I must have been about 18 when I read it. For me, Margaret Atwood was the first, I guess, adult author that I absolutely fell in love with and had to read all her books, and have loved almost every single one that I've read so far. I feel like with my reading progression, I kind of went from reading kids books and YA books to reading classics to finally getting around to start reading adult fiction, and for me, Margaret Atwood represents that first adult book that I read and realised that I could start actually relating to adult stories and stories featuring adults. Number 7 is For Isobel by Amy Witting. The copy of the book that I actually read was from the library. I recently found this in an op shop, so I'll put up the cover for the version that I read, because the reason I picked this up was because I decided to read more Australian fiction, and the easiest way to find new Australian authors that I'd not heard of was to pick out some text classics from my library. Text continually publish great works of fiction from Australian authors, and it's really amazing that they're doing this, allowing new audiences to have access to these authors that might otherwise have disappeared. So I really knew nothing about this book when I picked it up, except that it was about a woman called Isabel, and I absolutely fell in love with the story and the character, and fell in love with its sequel as well. And for me, this book is a reminder that picking up random books off the shelves can lead to you finding your new favourite book. Number 6 is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. Like the strange teenager I was, I asked for Charles Dickens' entire works for my 16th birthday, as I guess 16 is kind of considered a special number, so I thought I should get a special birthday present. My parents, or mostly my mum, very kindly found all of his works from secondhand bookshops, of which there are thankfully very many in the Blue Mountains, and so I have read almost all his books. I haven't read Barnaby Rudge because it did take me years and years to read all of his books, and I kind of was a bit over it by the time I got to that one, so I'm sure I will pick up Barnaby Rudge in the future. Although I love many of his books, the reason I picked Our Mutual Friend, which is his last completed novel, is because I think it was the novel where Dickens finally understood how to write female characters. The main female character, Bella, is an unlikable protagonist, finally. She's not some saintly angel like most of his likable likable female characters are. She is kind of stroppy and willful and is absolutely determined to get what she wants, and yet we still are allowed to be sympathetic with her and really follow along with her story. I also watched an adaptation of this before I read the book, and I also loved that adaptation. The actor who plays Bella is really great, so that may have clouded my judgment a little bit, but at least one Dickens definitely has to be on this list. Number 5 is Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. I must have read this book countless times, and I've definitely read through the entire series a few times. These books represent exactly what I loved about stories when I was a kid, which was children having their own agency and going on adventures. I was never the biggest fantasy lover, although I did read a lot of children's fantasy novels, and so what I loved about these books is the fact that they're not fantasy, they are just children with enormous imaginations, also children very lucky to have very lenient parents, and I wanted so much to be part of the Walker family. The thing I also love about these books is that although the books are about friendships, they're also about siblings, and my sister and I have always been practically joined at the hip since she was born, and so I've always loved books about siblings who are really close. Number 4 is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Again, I had to pick one Jane Austen book to go on this list, and the reason I picked this one is because it is about 3 sisters, though mainly about the oldest 2, Eleanor and Marion. I of course watched the film before I read the book, and always very much related to Eleanor being the oldest sister. In my mind, Jane Austen is just the most wonderful writer that has ever existed. I don't think there's anyone better than her at characters and at humour and stories that are about what perhaps would have been considered completely ordinary things in the day, but to us in the modern era seem so fantastical. And having watched Jane Austen adaptations since I was basically 2 years old when the 1995 Pride and Prejudice TV series came out, Jane Austen is just so much a part of my family's language. Number 3 is Howard's End by EM Forster. This copy I found in an op shop, and I didn't really know anything about the story. I just knew that EM Forster wrote A Room with a View, and so I thought I'd pick it up and give it a go. I especially love Howard's End because again it is about 2 sisters, but also because it is about class, and class is something I find endlessly fascinating. This book is about the British class system, specifically about the 3 classes in terms of the working class, the intellectual upper class who have always had money, and then the upper class who made their own money. I find class in Australia incredibly fascinating because I don't think it is quite as clear as it is in England. Australia likes to think of itself as a classless society, which is clearly not the case. The distinctions of class in Australia are something relatively subtle in that I have trouble describing them, but because I've grown up in this culture I know them instinctively and I know exactly where I sit in this class structure. But anyway, this is why Howard's End is on this list, because that discussion of class is so well drawn out in this book. Number 2 is All in the Blue Unclouded Weather by Robin Klein. Robin Klein is my favourite children's author. She is an Australian writer who wrote copious amounts of novels during kind of the 80s and the 90s mainly. This book is kind of historical fiction, but I wouldn't consider it historical fiction. It's set in the late 40s. I know that it is based on Robin Klein's own childhood of living during that time, so it has an incredible rawness and realness to it. It was inevitable that I would love these books as a child and still love them because it is about 4 sisters all with red hair, and I think this is the first book I read that made me feel like I could perhaps belong in this country. My whole family are very much Anglophiles and I feel like I've been brought up on a British culture without ever having gone to that country, and this was finally something written in Australia about Australians that I could identify with. There is so much life and imagination in these stories from these 4 sisters, and they're such beautiful depictions of what it is like to be a girl growing up. And at number 1 is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. In terms of adult books, this is the book I've read the most. I've read this book 3 times, and every single time, despite it being quite a chunky book, I have just flown through it. There is something so captivating about this novel that I can't quite put to words always, because I just am drawn to it instinctually almost. Charlotte Bronte has just created the most amazing, complicated heroine in Jane Eyre. The people around her see her as this timid and shy and quiet person, but because we get access to her thoughts and feelings, we know that she is ferocious and fiery and will not take any shit from Mr. Rochester. And although she is small and ugly and poor, she knows exactly what she wants to get out of life. I'm not sure if anyone genuinely reads this and thinks it's a love story. I hope not, because to me it is not a love story in any way. It is a book about a woman stuck in a society that does not allow her to be free, and so she finds a way to be free, because although she has to marry Mr. Rochester to get this freedom, she ends up being the one in charge. He is too frail and weak to do anything, and she's suddenly got all this power. Jane Eyre is definitely my favourite book of all time. I relate to her as a character, and I also find the dramatic sides of the story so engrossing, plus the Victorian era is an era that is so fascinating to me. There was just no way that I could not love this novel. So those were my 10 submissions for the Booktube Top Tens tag. If you've done this tag, let me know below and I will go check out your video. I hope you have a great day and I will see you soon. Bye!